I was camping in the middle of nowhere in Washington near Mountain Rainier. Like not an official campground, just way out in the forest where I wouldn't have expected another human for miles. One night I woke up and heard something, and I opened my tent, and there's this guy sitting by where my fire had been right outside my tent. Nothing particularly noteworthy about the guy, just a very regular looking dude just sitting there a couple feet away from my tent. No bag or pack or anything with him, just a guy. He saw me open the tent, his eyes got huge like he had just seen a ghost, and he took off. It shook me up pretty badly, but over the next day I managed to put it out of my mind fairly well, after writing it off as just some odd occurrence and a guy that was probably high or something, and had somehow managed to set up a camp coincidentally not far from mine. Then 2 days after that, and 10 to 15 miles away in totally random directions that nobody could take the same path as on accident, I was sitting by the fire that night and started hearing noises that I got more and more convinced were a person. I called out to them, and out of the darkness someone was like, "Do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?" I said no. I don't even think that's a real place there. They kept talking from just out of my line of vision. I tried to see them with my flashlight, but they yelled, "Aim that away," and kind of spooked and not wanting to piss off a potentially crazy person, I did. After like 15 minutes of me being very freaked out and them talking and asking completely random questions from the darkness, it sounded like the voice had gotten closer, so I shined my light that way again, and it was the same dude who had been outside my tent 2 nights before. He had to have followed me almost 15 miles over 2 days, because there's no way he could have just accidentally wound up in the same spot as west as that wilderness is. No possible way. As soon as my light hit him, he took off again. I started to chase him but didn't want to get lost in wilderness in the dark, so I stopped quickly after probably only 100 to 200 feet. This one couldn't be written off, because the only way he could have been in both places is specifically if he was following me. I decided the trip was very over first thing in the morning and hiked back out over 3 days, constantly doubling back, trying to throw anyone following off my trail, and occasionally hiding and waiting to see if he would come by following me. I really can't describe how terrifying it was to feel like I was being hunted through the woods, and to actually have to brainstorm on things I could do to best avoid potentially being murdered. On the first night of hiking out, twice I heard what sounded like a person walking circles outside my tent, but by the time I mustered the courage to look, nobody was there. On the second night, I heard what I thought was an animal, making noises at first in the distance, but slowly sounded more like a human making animal calls. It could have actually been an animal, but I didn't actually see the guy again. But it really sounded like a person making howling noises. I literally almost cried when I finally got back to my car. The relief was so strong. To this day, probably the most terrifying experience I've ever had. I have no idea who the guy was or what his intentions were, and no way of getting an explanation, but I really can't articulate just what a terrifying few days it was. I wasn't sure about sharing this story. It still gives me shivers every time I remember what happened. This happened in the Amazonas, in the border between Brazil and Peru. The jungle. It's an amazing place to live. Everyone knew each other, and I had a big group of friends of different ages. The only horrible part of the Amazon is the existence of terrorist groups that try to control the region. I was 7 when this happened. Every kid on the village knew we had freedom to go anywhere, as long as it is not close to the terrorists, and that we could never leave the village at night. My parents taught me, since I was very little, how to hide in case something happens, and to run if I see that things are getting dangerous. I remember all adults of the village were celebrating something. I think it was an Amazon party like Halloween. I remember my mother painting her face in a tribal way, and all the children went together to a house to stay safe and have fun. The eldest girl was in charge. She was 17, and as soon as our parents left, she ignored us and left with her friends. Our closest group consisted of 6 children. I was one of the youngest ones, and we all listened to the most adventurous one, Leon, who was 14. Whatever Leon said, We followed because he was fun, always making challenges, and he knew how to take care of us. Yes, despite him being reckless, he was our friend. We loved him and knew he would never abandon us if something happened. After playing soccer and eating, the six of us became bored. Karla, one of the six, had the idea to dress up like our parents did, with tribal makeup and dresses. We agreed, and soon we were all dressed up like the kids who lived in the village of the deepest regions of the Amazon. I remember us playing around until Lian said to, and I quote, "Let's explore the Amazon and find a hidden treasure." We all cheered and agreed to leave. It was easy to escape, since the girl who was supposed to take care of us left us. Lian managed to find a lantern and a boat, big enough for 6, and we decided to sail. It was around midnight, but we didn't care. Just imagine 6 kids dressed up, on a boat, splashing water everywhere and trying to find an imaginary treasure. No phones, no adults, just the jungle and us. It was life at its purest. Everything seemed to be perfect, until we heard people calling, "Who's there?" and we saw a lighted boat approaching. Quickly, Lian dropped the lantern and instructed us to lay down on the boat's floor and stay very still. It was one of the scariest moments of my life. I remember clearly how we were all with our bellies to the floor, grabbing our hands and not even daring to breathe. But it was too late. "Stop hiding! I see you," a voice said, as the guy illuminated our boat. We stood up, and I saw 4 men with guns. And I'm not talking about small pistols, pointing at us. They laughed and said, "They're a bunch of children." Lian put himself in front and said that we were on a hurry because our parents were expecting us home. The biggest guy, who had a red bandana, laughed again and said, "Little kids should not be here alone at night. You could disappear here in the jungle and no one will ever find you." At this point, I was super scared and Carol started crying. "You can go. You're just tribe Huahua, which means baby in Quechua." And they left. I remember all of us hugging each other, crying and sailing as fast as we could. Once we got home, we entered the house and closed all doors and windows. We all slept together on the floor. Before that, we agreed not to tell this anyone on the village, not the elders or our parents. Even now, no one knows what happened that night. Years later, I understood why they let us go. They thought we were kids from the local tribe. We had no value to them. If they had known that we were dressed up and were from the village, I probably wouldn't be typing this story. As a child, I had a few frightening experiences in the woods behind my childhood home. We lived there until I was 17. I'm 24 now. A few weeks ago, I finally found a possible explanation for what happened. I spent a lot of time hiking and exploring, mostly alone. In the rural southwest Pennsylvania on the border of West Virginia Panhandle, the forest behind our property was a few miles deep. In it was a small valley with a creek at the bottom. It was really pretty and had multiple waterfalls. There was also a natural spring, swamp, a huge section of bent trees covered in thick vines, and a cluster of mining equipment across the creek. The tree line was about 60 yards from our back door. The large trail that went down into the valley was in the center of the tree line that bordered our yard just beyond the start of the trees. There was a smaller trail to the right that ran along the edge of our yard and branched off into the thick vine area. The voice. My most prominent memory was the day I heard the voice. I was about 11 years old and it was late fall. The leaves had fallen and it was cold, but it wasn't snowing. Weeds and brush were thin, there was a lot of visibility. I walked down the main trail for about 10 minutes to the bottom where the trail veered to the left. There was a small clearing at the bend where my dad would dump grass clippings and old straw bales. I frequently walked to this area. It was more like an extension of our yard. I never felt afraid there, but this time a weird feeling washed over me, like I was being watched. I called out, "Hello?" And immediately a child's voice responded, "Hello." It sounded so close, as if they were standing directly in front of me. I stood in disbelief for a moment, but eventually started looking around. The leaves were on the ground and the homes around us had small children. I even checked the trees for tree stands. It did not terrify me, but I definitely did not want to stay down there, so I decided to go back up to our house. I was about halfway up the trail when I felt 2 taps on my left shoulder. I whipped around expecting to catch my brothers messing with me, but no one was there. And again, I did not hear any footsteps. I started walking again and felt the same 2 taps about 30 seconds later. That was it. I ran as fast as I could until I got home. That was the first time I heard the child's voice. As the years went on, I began hearing it inside the house as well, but that's a different story. I was born in 1996, so we had internet access growing up, but it wasn't like what we have today. We also did not have cell phones yet. That being said, I never thought to look up our house on Google Maps until after we moved. Earlier I mentioned how the woods were a few miles deep, but for most of my life I assumed there was another house or road up on the other side of the valley. We often heard sounds of people talking and children playing off in the distance. Nothing creepy, it just sounded like we were getting close to another property and people were outside, like an echo. Our parents told us we owned the land down the creek, so we rarely explored the other side, but I did try once. I was older at the time, about 14. I had hiked down to the creek and was following it upstream to the east. I came across a large trail going up onto the side we did not own. I decided I wanted to finally see who lived up there. I walked for about 5 minutes and began smelling something horribly rotten. I was gagging and had to hold my nose. About 20 feet in front of me was a dead deer, sitting just off the trail to the left. I convinced myself to walk past it, and the smell settled, so I continued down the trail. The trail flattened out and turned to the right. It seemed like it was getting darker, but it was still early afternoon. The trees seemed thicker and closer, like the trail was narrowing. I walked for about 30 yards when I came across a dead rabbit sitting directly in the middle of the trail at my feet. That's it. That's when it hit me. Something was wrong. My fight or flight response kicked in and a wave of fear hit me. The trail was so dark and I swear I could see the trees moving inward toward me, like tunnel vision. Up until this point I heard the voices of the people, but now it was silent. I bolted back down the trail, and the feeling of fear went away once I crossed back to our side. I guess it could have been a bear or coyote. We do have natural defense instincts even if we don't see it. Another thing to note is the deer and rabbits weren't eaten or bloody. They were just dead. After we moved, I went on Google Maps satellite view to show someone at my new school where I used to live. I zoomed out and that's when I realized there was nothing behind the house but trees. There was never another house back there. There was a small field between us and our neighbors to the right. Their yard dipped into a hill right before the tree line. That section wasn't mowed frequently because of the hill and was often just tall grass. We were outside with the neighbor girl when we found a bronze oval figurine sitting in the tall grass. It wasn't buried, it was on top of the grass. We took it to her mom thinking it was theirs, but she said it was not. We asked my parents and it wasn't theirs either. We even asked the neighbors on the other side and not theirs. It was too far from the road to fall out of a car or to be thrown out like litter. And who is really out there littering with bronze anyway? So I took it home. I kept it in my room for a while, but it began to creep me out. Our house was already haunted, but things seemed more frequent since bringing it in. I did not want to throw it away, I did not want to disrespect it like that, so I took it into the woods by myself and left it on a stump far from the trail. I don't even remember where the stump was. I felt better with it out of the house. The next spring, my dad was tilling and getting ready to plant the corn for the year. He dug it up, the same oval figurine, with the same marking underneath. There was a black marking on the bottom and it had sat on top of something for a long time. I couldn't believe it. He tiled every year. There's no way another one was in there that whole time. We couldn't explain it, but we kept it. It sat on our kitchen window sill until the day we moved. Then it came with us. My mom finally threw it away a few weeks ago. I didn't know until after she did it. There were other smaller things about the woods that weren't necessarily paranormal, but definitely odd. There was one set of lines that came down into a circle with an opening like a doorway. Think of shape like of a teepee. I did not like going into the area with the bent trees alone. Some had 90 degrees bends in them and were covered in thick vines. It felt like a whole different forest in there. My brothers and I used to say there were witches in that part or pretend it was cursed. Playtime gets weird when you grow up in a haunted house. I only saw the mining equipment once. I could never find it again. Sometimes I wonder if it was really there. But my brothers were with me that time and saw it too. There was a minecart, some track and a large machine. I never saw a mine entrance, but my brother said he found one once. The swamp was very random. It wasn't like at the bottom of the valley near the creek either. The hillside just flattened out and it was like a bog. Picture thick vertical weeds and cattails taller than you. The center was cleared out in a circle. I walked through it once and it was only a foot deep, although I'm glad I only went in once. There could have been an opening or deep spot. I was foolish to assume I could walk on it. To the left of the main trail, about 10 yards into the tree line, was a large gaping hole that was partially filled in with cement blocks and bricks. One day when I was young, I distinctly remember speaking in gibberish as I was hiking alone. I can't remember why, and no one was with me. No one ever responded, but I can't remember why I did that. I just did. Present day. Even as an adult, and someone who hasn't lived there for 7 years, I still have recurring nightmares about the woods. Not so much about the house. A month or two ago, I had a vivid dream and decided I needed answers. I am from a small town and a lot of people have family from the original settlers. I posted on Facebook asking if anyone knew or had family that knew the history of the area. One of the guys I went to school with messaged me. He explained how his grandparents were original to the village. He said there was an entire mining town up the road from us that's no longer there. Only a few houses remain. The mines, however, extended down the road to the area where our house now stands. He has pictures and maps of it. He asked what our address was and asked a family friend of his for more info. This man said the main portal to one of the mines was directly behind our house, which could explain the gaping field and hole just beyond the tree line. I asked him if there were any accidents or deaths in the mines. He said there were many accidents, but he didn't know the specifics. Then before I could even ask, he said, and I get chills from thinking about this, that 8-year-old boys and even younger kids worked in the mines too. He sent me a photo of his grandfather with some other miners, and there were 2 young boys in the picture. What if a child died and that's who I was hearing? He's also a local firefighter and said they still get calls from people falling through the air shafts into the mines. He said the EPA finally came in after we moved to close some of the portals. The KKK was also a big problem at one point. There's a town heritage center in one of the still standing mine houses, but before that opened, people still lived there. One day the kids climbed under the house while playing and found human remains. After an investigation they determined it was from the clan initiations back in the day. It seemed like it was kept quiet. He said the entire area is known for being haunted. The dark history goes all the way back to the battles with the Native Americans when it was first settled. Other firemen and his own parents have seen things. As far as we know, there were no deaths in our house. I always wondered if it was from the land, not the building, and this solidified my theory. I can't believe I waited years to reach out to people in the community. It's such a relief knowing I'm not alone and there could be a reason for it.